At the edge of the ancient world, there was a door no one dared to open. Beyond it, waited Persia, the richest, largest, most terrifying empire on earth. An empire that had swallowed nations for 200 years. And in 334 BC, a 22-year-old king decided he would walk through that door anyway. His name was Alexander. He wasn't supposed to win. His army was outnumbered. His kingdom was fragile. Greek cities behind him were already plotting rebellion, and the Persian king had enough gold to buy 10 armies like his. But Alexander didn't come to bargain. He came to break history. He marched into Asia with a force so small it looked like suicide, and then he did the impossible. He started defeating armies that should have erased him in a single afternoon. Every victory made him more dangerous. Every mile he moved forward, the world became smaller. Until the question wasn't, can Alexander survive? But how far will he go before nothing is left to conquer? Because Alexander wasn't chasing land. He was chasing a myth. The idea that a human being could become immortal. Not by living forever, but by being remembered forever. And to reach that immortality, he was willing to burn cities, shatter empires, and push his men past the limits of sanity. But here's the mystery. Was Alexander a genius liberator, or a young king consumed by a dream too vast for any human mind? He conquered the world before he turned 30. Then, at the height of power, he veered suddenly, leaving behind a broken empire, a haunting question, and a legacy so massive that even today, the world still lives in his shadow. This is Alexander the Great, the boy who became a storm, the man who tried to reach the end of the earth and found something darker waiting there. Before we dive into how Alexander pulled off the impossible, hit like if you're ready for a story that reshaped the world. And subscribe because this isn't just a war story. It's the rise of a legend you won't want to miss. Before Alexander became the Great, before the Persian Empire trembled at his name, he was simply a prince born into a kingdom that most of Greece considered half barbarian. Macedonia wasn't the center of the civilized world. Athens mocked it. Sparta ignored it. Though the Greeks, Macedonians were rough mountain people, good fighters, but not true heirs of Greek glory. But Macedonia was changing. Because Alexander's father was Philip II, a man who didn't just rule Macedonia, he rebuilt it into a war machine. Philip took a fractured, vulnerable kingdom and forged it into the most disciplined army in Europe. He introduced the sarissa, a spear so long it turned Macedonian infantry into a moving wall of iron. He trained cavalry to strike like thunder, and one by one, Greek city-states fell under his influence. Philip had one dream above all, to unite Greece and invade Persia, the old enemy of the Greek world. But Philip's greatest weapon wasn't his army. It was his son. Alexander was born in 356 BC, in the royal palace of Pella. From the beginning, his life was wrapped in legend. His mother, Olympias, was intense, mystical, and fiercely ambitious. She filled young Alexander's mind with stories that his bloodline was divine, descended from Achilles on his mother's side and Heracles on his father's. To Alexander, these weren't bedtime stories. They were destiny. As a boy, Alexander was restless, quick to anger, but even quicker to learn. He didn't fear pain, didn't fear risk. He feared only one thing, a life without greatness. There's a famous moment that captures him perfectly. A wild horse was brought to Philip's court. No rider could tame it. It kicked, screamed, and threw everyone off. Alexander watched in silence, then stepped forward. He noticed something the grown men didn't. The horse was terrified of its own shadow. So Alexander turned the horse toward the sun, spoke softly, and rode it like he was born for war. The court stood stunned. Philip, his father, looked at him and said, "My son, Macedonia is too small for you." That horse was Bucephalus, and Alexander would ride him into history. When Alexander reached his teens, Philip made a bold decision. He hired the greatest teacher alive to educate his son. For 3 years, Aristotle trained Alexander's mind like a blade. He taught him philosophy, science, politics, literature. He filled Alexander's imagination with Homer, especially the Iliad. Alexander didn't, admire Achilles. He wanted to be him. He slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow like a soldier keeping a weapon close. But the palace wasn't peaceful. Philip was a conqueror and a man of many marriages. Every new wife meant a new potential heir. Every feast was soaked in politics. And Olympias, Alexander's mother, was constantly fighting to keep her son's claim to the throne secure. So Alexander grew up in a world where love and power were inseparable, and where betrayal was always one step away. By 16, Alexander was already acting like a king. Philip left him as regent while he campaigned. A rebellion rose in Thrace. Alexander crushed it. He founded his first city there and named it Alisan. It was a preview of what was coming. Then, at 18, he stood beside his father at the Battle of Chaeronea, 338 BC. It was the battle that broke Greek resistance. The sacred band of Thebes, the most elite warriors in Greece, stood firm against Philip's line. Then Alexander led the cavalry charge. He smashed through them. The Greek world fell that day, and it was clear to everyone. Philip may have built the empire, but Alexander was born to expand it. Yet history doesn't wait. In 336 BC, Philip II was assassinated at his daughter's wedding. The celebration turned into chaos. A king collapsed bleeding on the floor. Alexander was only 20, and the moment he took the crown, the world around him began to crack. Greek cities revolted. Northern tribes prepared to invade. Persia watched closely, waiting for Macedonia to collapse from within. Most kings would have inherited fear. Alexander inherited fire. And the first thing he did was prove that he was not a boy sitting on a stolen throne. He was a king the world was about to learn to fear. When Philip died, Macedonia didn't just lose a king. It lost the glue holding everything together. To the Greek city-states, Philip's assassination looked like an opening. Athens whispered about freedom. Thebes began plotting revolt. Sparta watched from the shadows. In the north, tribal kings prepared to strike Macedonia while it was weak. And in Persia, the great king Darius III saw something even better. A young, inexperienced heir who would collapse under the weight of his father's empire. They thought Alexander would beg for loyalty. Instead, he moved like lightning. Alexander was crowned at 20, but he understood something most rulers learn too late. The throne belongs to whoever takes it fast enough. So before Greece could unite against him, he marched south at full speed. He wasn't just traveling. He was announcing a reality. You don't get to decide if I'm king. I already am. At Corinth, the Greek leaders met him. Some came to negotiate. Some came to test him. Alexander didn't negotiate. He demanded the same title his father held. Hegemon of Greece, commander of the united Greek forces. One by one, the city-states bowed. Not because they loved him, because they were uncertain whether resisting this young king would mean war. But Alexander couldn't stay in Greece long. If the north fell, everything fell. So he turned around and marched into Thrace and Illyria, lands of fierce tribes who had never accepted Macedonian control. They expected a slow royal campaign. They got a storm. Alexander crossed Brudin mountain passes, hit the rebels before they could gather, and destroyed their armies so completely that tribes who hadn't even rebelled immediately submitted. It was not just a victory. It was a message to the entire world. You will not outlast me. And that's when the real test came. While Alexander was away in the north, a rumor spread through Greece. Alexander is dead. It wasn't true. But in politics, truth doesn't matter as much as timing. Thebes rose in open rebellion. They killed Macedonian officials. They called on Athens to join. This was the moment Greece had waited for. A chance to break free. But they misjudged two things. Alexander was alive. Alexander was already marching. In an almost impossible speed march, he returned from the north and appeared outside Thebes. Before they could even believe the news, Thebes panicked. They asked for negotiations. Alexander offered mercy. But Thebes chose war. What happened next became a warning carved into Greek memory. Alexander attacked. The battle was brutal and fast. Macedonian forces poured into the city like floodwater. Street by street, Thebes collapsed. Then Alexander made a decision that shocked the ancient world. He destroyed Thebes completely. The city was burned. Its walls were torn down. Thousands were killed. Survivors were sold into slavery. Only temples and the house of a famous poet were spared. Why so extreme? Because Alexander wasn't punishing Thebes alone. He was crushing the idea that anyone could rebel and live to try again. After Thebes, Athens trembled. Sparta stayed quiet. Greece fell silent. No one doubted his crown anymore. Now Alexander stood at the head of Greece and Macedonia, not as a boy king, but as a ruler who had already done what even hardened generals feared enough not to attempt. He had made an example of a great city and terrified an entire civilization into obedience. And with Greece secured, Alexander turned to the dream Philip never lived to fulfill. He gathered his generals. He addressed his army. Then he pointed eastward, toward the Persian Empire. To most men, Persia was too big to defeat. Too rich, too ancient, too powerful. But to Alexander, Persia wasn't an empire. It was a challenge. The final door at the edge of the world, and he was about to open it with a sword. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander stood at the edge of Europe, staring across a narrow stretch of water called the Hellenistic. On the other side was Asia. On the other side was Persia. On the other side was the enemy that had haunted Greek memory for generations. Batti soixante, just another invasion. This was history's biggest gamble. Alexander had around 35,000 men. Persia could raise hundreds of thousands. Persia had more money, more territory, more soldiers. By logic alone, this war should end before it began. Yet Alexander stepped onto a ship like a man stepping into legend. When he reached the Asian shore, he did something symbolic, almost theatrical. He threw a spear into the ground and declared Asia won by the spear. He didn't come to negotiate. He came to take. Before marching inland, Alexander diverted to a place that mattered more than strategy. Troy, the city of Homer's Iliad, the battlefield of Achilles. Here Alexander made sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles. He honored him like a brother, like a model of the life Alexander wanted. He even ran races around the site with his companions, as if reenacting myth. To his army, this was inspiring. To Alexander, it was something deeper. He wasn't just declaring war on Persia. He was declaring who he believed he was. Not Philip's son, not a Macedonian king, but the next Achilles, the hero who would live forever through glory. The Persian commanders didn't panic. They had seen Greek armies before. They believed Alexander was young, arrogant, and reckless. Their plan was simple. Meet him early, crush him quickly, end the war before it spreads. So, near the Granicus River, Persian satraps gathered cavalry and Greek mercenaries. They chose high ground across the riverbank, a perfect defensive position. They waited for Alexander to make the obvious move. Camp, probe, cross carefully. But Alexander didn't fight obvious wars. Alexander rode to the river and saw the Persian line. His generals warned him, "Don't attack now. The river will break our formation. The cavalry above us will slaughter us." Alexander listened, then ordered the attack anyway. He personally led the charge into the river, splashing through water under a storm of arrows. It was chaos. Men slipping on wet stones, horses struggling in the current, Persian cavalry smashing down from the heights. For a moment, it almost worked for Persia. Alexander was nearly killed. A Persian nobleman swung a blade at his head, close enough to split his helmet. But one of Alexander's companions, Cletus, struck the attacker down just in time. And then the battle turned. Alexander's cavalry broke through first. Macedonian infantry climbed the bank behind them like a rising wall. The Persian line collapsed. Under the pressure, The river that should have trapped Alexander became the trap for Persia. By the end, Persian cavalry was shattered. Their Greek mercenaries were surrounded and slaughtered. Asia Minor lay open. It wasn't just a victory, it was a shock wave. In a single battle, Alexander proved three terrifying truths. He would fight when others wouldn't dare. He would lead from the front, risking everything. He could beat Persia in open battle. To his men, he looked invincible. To Persia, he looked like something worse. A young king who didn't understand fear and couldn't be predicted. After Granicus, cities along the coast began surrendering. Some welcomed him like a liberator. Others resisted and fell. But everywhere he went, the story spread faster than the army itself. Alexander had crossed into Asia, and Persia had already bled. The war was no longer a border clash. It had become a march toward the heart of an empire, and the empire was waking up to the truth. This wasn't a Greek raid. This was a conquest. After Granicus, Alexander didn't slow down. He moved like a wave rolling down the coast of Asia Minor. Cities surrendered. Garrisons fell. Treasuries opened, and with every mile, Alexander's army grew richer and more convinced that fate marched beside them. But not every city bowed. Some would make Alexander bleed before they let him pass. The Persian-controlled city of Halicarnassus was a fortress. High walls, strong navy support, commanded by experienced Persian officers and Greek mercenaries. Alexander wanted it because control of the coast meant something crucial. Persia could no longer outflank him by sea. The siege was brutal. Persian defenders launched night raids, burned siege towers, and fought with desperate skill. For the first time in Asia, Alexander couldn't win through speed alone. He had to grind. And when the walls finally broke, the Persians retreated into the inner city and set parts of it on fire behind them. Alexander captured Halicarnassus. But it reminded him, this war wouldn't be a parade. Persia could still bite. As Alexander pushed inland into Phrygia, he reached the town of Gordian. Inside its temple sat an ancient escort tied with an impossibly tangled rope, the Gordian Knot. A prophecy surrounded it. Whoever untied the knot would rule Asia. Kings and warriors had tried for centuries. No one succeeded. Alexander stood before it in silence. Not as a general, but as a man who believed destiny was something you take, not wait for. He examined the knot. Then, in one sharp motion, he drew his sword and cut it clean in half. Some say it was arrogance. Some say it was genius. But to the army watching, the meaning was clear. Alexander wasn't just conquering Asia. Asia was meant to be his, and the myth of him was growing faster than the war itself. Back in the Persian heartland, the great king Darius III could no longer ignore this. Granicus had been a humiliation. Cities were falling, satraps were failing. So Darius did what Persian kings had done, only in the most serious wars. He gathered the royal army. This wasn't a regional defense force. This was Persia, as a full weight. Troops from across the empire marched under one banner. Persians, Medes, Armenians, Babylonians, cavalry from the east, and thousands of Greek mercenaries. The message was unmistakable. Enough, the king will handle this himself. Darius wasn't coming to negotiate. He was coming to erase Alexander. In 333 BC, Darius marched west toward Alexander with a massive army. He expected open ground where Persia's numbers and cavalry could dominate. But something went wrong. Alexander maneuvered quicker than Darius expected. The Persian army ended up near a narrow coastal plain by the town of Issus, hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. A battlefield too tight for Persia's advantage. Instead of an open slaughter, it was going to be a knife fight in a hallway. When Alexander saw where Darius had placed himself, he reportedly smiled. Because the terrain didn't matter to a storm. It mattered to the empire about to be hit by one. Issus was not just a battle. It was a collision of two worlds. A young king who fought at the front. A great king who ruled from the center of a vast empire. Persia spread across the plain in glittering depth. Thousands of troops, banners, armor, chariots. Alexander's army looked tiny by comparison. And yet, Alexander didn't hesitate. He attacked the Persian center like a spear aimed at the heart. The fighting was savage. At one point, Alexander drove so deep into the enemy line that he could see Darius's royal chariot in the distance, and that's when the moment arrived that changed everything. Darius panicked, whether from fear or confusion, we can't fully know. But Persia's king turned his chariot around and ran. The sight of their great king fleeing shattered Persian morale in a heartbeat. The entire Persian line broke. What should have been Alexander's defeat became one of the greatest victories in human history. When the battlefield settled, Alexander found something no conqueror expected. Darius had left behind his family, his mother, wife, and children. To the ancient world, capturing the king's family was like capturing the king's soul. Alexander treated them with respect, even honor. But the message to Persia was loud. Your king ran, your army collapsed. Your empire is falling. Issus wasn't just a win. It was the moment the world realized Persia could be beaten, and Alexander might actually reach the end of the earth. If you're enjoying this journey so far, subscribe right now, because the next battles get bigger, darker, and far more shocking. After Issus, Alexander stood on the edge of a collapsing Persian dream. Darius had fled, the Persian army had shattered, and now the road to the empire's heart was open. But Alexander didn't chase the king immediately. Instead, he turned south, toward the Phoenician coast. It was the move that would decide the whole war. Because Persia still had one deadly advantage: its navy. As long as Persian ships controlled the Mediterranean, they could cut Alexander's supply lines, incite Greek rebellions behind him, and strand him deep in enemy territory. So Alexander made a cold, strategic choice before he marches into Persia's heart. He will rip away Persia's coastline, city by city, harbor by harbor. He would take the sea away from an empire. Most ports surrendered, but one city said no. One city believed it was untouchable. That city was Tyre. Tyre wasn't just a Portuguese. It was a fortress, a wealthy, ancient island city sitting half a mile off the mainland, surrounded by thick walls that rose straight out of the sea. For centuries, Tyre had defied empires. Even Persian kings treated it carefully. Tyre believed the ocean was its shield. When Alexander demanded entry to worship in their temple, Tyre refused. Not just refused, they insulted him. They told him he could worship on the mainland instead. In Alexander's world, that wasn't diplomacy. That was a challenge. And Alexander never walked away from a challenge. Alexander had no fleet strong enough to storm an island fortress, so he did something that sounds like madness. Even today, he decided to build a road through the sea. He ordered his army to tear apart the ruins of the old coastal city and dump stone, timber, and earth into the water. Day after day, the causeway crept forward like a scar across the sea. The Tyrians laughed at first, then panicked. They launched fire ships. They rained arrows and spears. They dove from their walls to sabotage the construction. At one point, they set Alexander's siege towers ablaze and pushed them into the water. It was the most stubborn resistance Alexander had ever faced. Months passed. His men were exhausted, supplies strained. Even some generals wondered if this siege was worth it. But Alexander's mind was locked. If Tyre survives, Persia survives. So he did what only Alexander would do. He gathered ships from conquered Phoenician ports, built a fleet while besieging the city, and returned to Tyre with the sea itself now under his control. The island had become a prison, with the fleet blocking escape and siege engines hammering the walls. Alexander struck from both land and sea. Finally, a section of wall collapsed. Macedonian troops poured in. What followed was brutal. Tyre was taken, street by street. Thousands died. Survivors were enslaved. It was one of the darkest episodes of Alexander's life. and also one of the most important, because when Tyre fell, the message shook the world. No city is unreachable, no wall is safe. Not even the sea can stop him. After Tyre, Alexander moved farther south. Only one major fortress blocked him before Egypt. Gaza. Like Tyre, Gaza refused to surrender. It sat on high ground with thick walls, and its commander swore to fight to the death. Alexander attacked anyway. The siege was fierce. Alexander was injured. Some say a dart or spear pierced his armor, but the city eventually fell. And once again, Alexander punished resistance viciously, because at this stage, he wasn't just taking territory. He was cutting away every place Persia could return to. By the time Alexander reached Egypt, Persia's navy was useless. No ports, no shelter, no supplies. The Mediterranean was no longer Persian water. It was his, and that changed the war forever. Now, Alexander could march east without fear of being trapped behind enemy lines. He had removed Persia's last strategic advantage. The king who ran it, Isus, could no longer hide behind the sea. And the next phase of Alexander's journey would take him somewhere even more legendary. Egypt, the land of gods, and a moment that would change how Alexander saw himself. When Alexander marched into Egypt, he didn't arrive as an invader. He arrived as a deliverer. Egypt had been crushed under Persian rule for generations. Heavy taxes, foreign governors, disrespect for their gods. So when word spread that the young king who broke Persia was coming south, Egypt opened its gates. No rebellion, no siege, not just a nation stepping aside to let a conqueror walk in like a prophecy fulfilled. In Memphis, Egyptian priests crowned Alexander as pharaoh. That title wasn't symbolic. It meant he was now seen as the rightful ruler of Egypt, not a foreign warlord. To the Egyptians, Alexander wasn't a Macedonian king. He was a man sent by fate to end Persian oppression. Alexander accepted the crown calmly, but inside him, something changed, because Egypt didn't just give him land. It gave him an idea that he might be more than human. Soon after arriving, Alexander made a strange decision. Instead of resting or preparing the next campaign, he turned west into the south. His generals were confused. His army was exhausted. The desert was lethal, but Alexander wasn't chasing military advantage. He was chasing a truth about himself. He wanted to visit the Oracle of Siwa, a sacred shrine to the god Amen, hidden deep in the desert. To the ancient world, oracles were in superstition. They were authority. Kings went to them to confirm destiny. And Alexander believed destiny was calling him by name. The journey was brutal. Sandstorms swallowed the horizon. Heat shattered men's strength. Moritan, once the army nearly lost its way. But Alexander pushed on. When he finally reached Siwa, he entered the sanctuary alone. No one knows exactly what the oracle told him. The priests never revealed it. But when Alexander came out, his faith was anti the same that ancient sources say. The oracle greeted him as son of Amen. In Greek ears, that meant something even bigger. Son of Zeus. Whether Alexander fully believed it or simply used it, from that day forward he began acting like a man who wasn't just chosen by the gods, but born from them. This wasn't a small psychological shift. It was the turning point of his life. Because after Alexander didn't just want to defeat Persia. He wanted to transcend humanity. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander stood on the Mediterranean coast and chose a strip of land facing the sea located imagined the future and ordered a city built there. He named it Alexandria, not for vanity alone. Alexandria was meant to be more than a monument. It was a bridge between worlds, Greek and Egyptian, Europe and Asia. A place where trade, culture, and knowledge could flow like a river. And it worked. Alexandria would become one of the greatest cities in history, home to the famous library, scholars, engineers, philosophers, a symbol of the world Alexander was trying to create, a world mixed into one. When Alexander finally marched out of Egypt in 331 BC, his army saw him as unstoppable. Egypt saw him as pharaoh, and Alexander saw himself as something rising beyond a king. He had crossed the sea, broken the coast, taken the land of gods, and heard a prophecy that rewired his soul. Now only one obstacle remained between him and total conquest: Darius and the Persian heartland. The final showdown was coming, and this time it wouldn't be on a narrow plain like ISS-US. It would be on the battlefield. Persia chose to end him. In 331 BC, the Persian Empire prepared for its last stand. Darius III wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. No narrow coastline, no mountains squeezing his army. This time, he chose the battlefield himself. Gaugamela, a wide flat plain near modern-day Iraq. Open ground, perfect for cavalry, chariots, and sheer numbers. Darius arrived with a force so massive that ancient writers struggled to count it. Tens of thousands, maybe more, cavalry from every province. War elephants and scythed chariots, designed to slice through infantry like blades on wheels. The ground was even flattened in advance so the chariots could run freely. This was Persia saying, "Here, on our terms. Now die." Alexander's army was smaller. Far smaller. Around 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. They knew how huge the Persian host was. They could see it stretching across the plain like an ocean of armor. Many Macedonians had never faced numbers like this. Fear crept through the camp. So that night Alexander walked among his soldiers, calm and silent. He didn't need speeches. He needed them to see one thing: their king wasn't afraid. His generals urged a night attack, surprise, confusion, quick strike. Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory." He wanted a win so clear that even Persia would know it was beaten. And then he slept. While his men trembled, Alexander slept like a man who already saw tomorrow. At dawn, the Persian army advanced out. The chariots charged first, screaming across the plain. But Alexander had prepared. His infantry opened lanes like doors. Javelins and arrows ripped into the charioteers. The chariots passed through empty gaps and were destroyed behind the Macedonian line. Persia's opening weapon neutralized. Then came the cavalry waves. Thousands of horsemen tried to wrap around Alexander's flanks like a tide closing in. And for a moment, it looked like the Macedonians might be crushed. But Alexander wasn't fighting a normal battle. He was setting a trap. Instead of charging straight forward, Alexander advanced diagonally to the right. It was a strange move at first. Even his enemies didn't understand it. But it forced Darius to respond. The Persian king kept shifting troops to match Alexander's motion, stretching his own center thinner and thinner, like pulling a rope too tight. And then Alexander saw it, a gap, a narrow opening in the Persian heart. That gap was all he needed. Alexander formed his cavalry into a wedge, a spear point of elite riders. Then, in a burst of speed, he drove straight into the gap, toward Darius himself. The Macedonian charge hit the Persian center like a hammer through glass. Persian lines buckled. Panic began spreading. Alexander was cutting through the battlefield like a man possessed. He wasn't aiming at the army. He was aiming at the king. Darius saw Alexander coming. He watched the center collapsing, and he did what no great king was supposed to do. He fled. Once again, the royal chariot turned away. Once again, Persia's heart stopped beating. The moment the soldiers saw their king leave, the Persian army shattered. A giant force turned into chaos. Men dropped weapons. Units dissolved. The whole line crumbled into a running flood. Alexander had done it. He had defeated Persia's greatest army on the battlefield. Persia chose, but the battle didn't end cleanly. While Alexander chased Darius, his left flank, led by Parmenion, was under brutal pressure. Persian cavalry had broken through there and threatened the Macedonian camp. Alexander faced a choice: keep chasing Darius, end the war, instantly. Turn back. Save his army. He turned back. He saved his men, crushed the Persian breakthrough, and only then resumed pursuit. Darius escaped, but his empire did not. After Gaugamela, the world transformed. Babylon opened its gates. Susa surrendered its treasure, Persepolis. The ceremonial heart of Persia fell soon after. Alexander wasn't just a conqueror anymore. He was the ruler of the largest empire on earth, and yet, the war inside him was only getting louder. Because for Alexander, victory didn't end the dream. It expanded Italiano. He had beaten Persia. Now he wanted to go farther, beyond what any map showed, beyond what any human had ever imagined. Alexander had just ended an empire. But here's the real question. Was this the moment he became the greatest ruler alive, or the moment the dream started consuming him? Drop a comment. Do you think Alexander was a genius hero, or a dangerous man blinded by ambition? I want to hear your take before we reach the final chapters. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire didn't fall in one day. It collapsed in echoes. One after another, the royal cities opened their gates. Babylon welcomed Alexander like a chosen king. Susa surrendered its unimaginable treasure. Then came the heart of Persian identity. Persepolis. This wasn't just a city. It was Persia, a ceremonial soul. The throne of kings. The place where emperors had ruled for 2 centuries with wealth that seemed endless. Alexander walked through its halls and took the treasure, gold and silver so vast it required thousands of animals to carry. But what he did next became one of the most debated acts of his life. One night, after a feast, Persepolis was set on fire. Flames climbed the palace columns, devouring the symbols of Persian power. Some say Alexander ordered it as revenge for Persia's burning of Athens long ago. Others say it was the drunken rage of victory. Some say he regretted it the next morning. Whatever the reason, the fire spoke louder than any speech. The Persian Age is over. A new world is beginning. Yet even as Persia burned, its king was still alive. Darius had escaped again, and Alexander was not done until the king was in his hands. Alexander chased Darius east into the rising deserts and mountains. But Persia wasn't just losing battles now. It was breaking from within. Persian nobles began turning on their own king. One of them, Bessus, betrayed Darius. He arrested him, declared himself king, and fled deeper into the empire. When Alexander finally caught up, he found Darius not on a throne but dying, abandoned in a court, stabbed by his own men. The world expected Alexander to celebrate. Instead, he wept. He covered Darius's body with his cloak and sent him for a royal burial. Because Alexander understood, to rule Persia, he couldn't be seen as its destroyer. He had to become its successor. From this moment, Alexander changed. He began wearing Persian royal clothing. He adopted Persian court rituals. He recruited Persians into his army and married into Persian nobility. To many Macedonians, this was betrayal. Why are we becoming the people we conquered? But to Alexander, it was destiny. He didn't want to rule Greeks over Persians. He wanted to rule a new empire of both. A single world under one king. And now that Persia was his, he looked further still. East, where the maps ended, where myths began. Beyond Persia lay lands the Greeks barely knew, rivers so wide they looked like seas, jungles, monsoons, war elephants, kingdoms untouched by Macedonian steel. Alexander marched into India in 326 BC, not because he needed more land, but because he needed the end of the world. He wanted to reach the outer ocean, the mythical boundary of Earth. His greatest battle there came against King Porus, who fought using towering elephants that terrified horses and men alike. The battle was savage. Alexander won, barely, but Porus didn't beg. He stood proud, wounded, and unbroken. Alexander asked, "How should I treat you?" Porus answered, "Like a king." Alexander admired him so much he restored Porus to his throne as an ally. It was one of Alexander's finest traits. He respected strength, even in enemies. But India revealed something else. Alexander's army was breaking. They had marched for years, across deserts, mountains, foreign worlds. They had seen friends die, cities burn, kingdoms fall. At the Hydaspes River, the soldiers refused to go further. They wanted home. Alexander argued, pushed, pleaded. But for the first time in his life, Alexander could not bend the world to his will. A turned back, not defeated by an enemy, but by the limits of human endurance. The return was worse than the conquest. Alexander led his army through the Gedrosian desert, a nightmare of heat and thirst. Tosans died, not in battle, but in sand. When he finally reached Persia again, he found an empire struggling to hold itself together. Governors were corrupt, old loyalties were cracking. Macedonians resented Persians, Persians resented Macedonians. Alexander tried to fuse them through marriages, shared armies, shared identity, but unity in an empire that huge required more than vision. It required time. And Alexander didn't have time, because the more he tried to become a god-king of a new world, the more isolated he became from his own people, and perhaps from himself. In 323 BC, Alexander reached Babylon, the center of his empire. He was 32 years old. He was planning new campaigns in Arabia, maybe even the West. His dream was still alive. Then, suddenly, he fell ill. Fever, weakness. Days passed. The strongest man on earth couldn't rise from bed. His generals gathered around him. "Who will inherit the empire?" they asked. Alexander Fady gave a final answer. "To the strongest," and then he died. No clear heir, no stable transfer of power, just a giant empire held together by the will of one man. Now gone. Within years, his generals tore the empire apart. Wars erupted. Kingdoms split into pieces. The dream of one world under Alexander collapsed into blood and rivalry. But the legend only grew. Alexander didn't just conquer territory. He blended civilizations. Greek language, art, architecture, and ideas spread across Egypt, Persia, Central Asia, and into India. New cities rose, many named Alexandria, becoming centers of culture and learning. This fusion created a new era, the Hellenistic world, where East and West met, mixed, and changed forever. Rome learned from Alexander's model. Future generals worshipped his tactics. Kings copied his image. Even enemies measured greatness by his shadow. He lived only 32 years. Yet he bent centuries. So what was Alexander the Great? A liberator, a genius, a conqueror possessed by ambition, a man chasing immortality until it consumed him. Maybe he was all of them. Because Alexander wasn't trying to be a king of Macedonia. He was trying to be a king of history. And in that, he succeeded. Even today, more than 2,000 years later, the world still speaks his name as if he never truly left it. Alexander, the boy who became a storm, the man who conquered the impossible and paid for it with everything.